Benedict, welcome to Giant Ideas. We'd love to start just by asking you maybe to compare and contrast the previous big technology era of mobile and Web 2.0 with today's era of AI. You were a sort of major analyst of the previous era. You're one of the big analysts of this era. How do you see the two and how do you compare them?
Well, so maybe there's sort of two answers to this. One of them is we are sort of at the stage now of like the internet in the mid-90s or mobile in the mid-2000s, when it was very clear that this was going to be an enormous thing, but it wasn't clear at all what the market structure was going to be, where the value capture is, what the building blocks are, how it all fits together, what it's going to look like. So you look at the web in the I've got this great diagram of from 1995 from a research house of something called cyberspace, within which it includes the matrix, within which is, obviously this is very 1995, within which there is something called the web. And because it kind of wasn't clear, it was clear everyone was going to have some kind of device that was connected to some kind of a network. It wasn't clear it was going to be a computer and not a terminal. It wasn't clear it would be the internet and not all these other networks. It wasn't clear the internet was going to be the web. It wasn't clear how the web was going to work. Like Tim Berners-Lee's original web browser had an editor because he thought this was kind of like a network drive. It was a document sharing system, not a publishing system. And it wasn't clear that all the value was going to be in search advertising and social. I mean, search advertising doesn't appear for another 5 years and social doesn't really work for another 10 years. Same thing with smartphones. And I bought my first smartphone in, 2001, maybe. Before the iPhone launched, we weren't like all sitting around like waiting for the asteroid to hit. It felt like it was slowly working. It wasn't clear that there was going to be this fundamental discontinuity. And we're sort of at the same stage now, I think, in that, like, you've got this thing that's amazingly cool, but it's not clear how it works. It's not clear where the value capture is of the market structure. It's not entirely clear what you do with it. There's a bunch of people kind of running around with their hair on fire saying, oh my God, it's amazing. You don't get it. This is everything. And then you go and look at the survey data and you see that basically like 75% of people in the developed world have looked at this stuff. And 50% of those people have said, well, I don't know what to do with this and never used it again. So there's this sort of sense that, like, the curve is ticking up, but we don't quite know what this is going to look like. I think there's a sort of a fundamental difference, which is that, in 2007, 2010, you knew what the next iPhone could and couldn't be. Like, you didn't know exactly what Apple was going to do, but like, you knew it couldn't like have 10 times the speed and it couldn't fly. It wasn't going to unfold. It wasn't going to roll up. It wasn't going to project onto the wall. In 1995, you kind of knew that the whole world wasn't going to have a PC with broadband in a year. You knew what the roadmap for deploying broadband was. You knew how fast computers could get, and so on. So you kind of knew, like at a kind of a basic physics level, what was going to be possible in 3 to 5 years' time. And we kind of don't know that with generative AI. So it may be that what we've got now is kind of going to flatten out in the next year or so. And what we've got now is kind of it. And it'll improve incrementally and it'll get faster and cheaper. But this is basically the level of capability we're going to have, or maybe a bit more. Or it may be that in 5 years' time, we'll all be queuing up to get our ration of gruel from our robot overlords. But but the point is we don't, I'm kind of exaggerating to make the point, but we don't have that same kind of basic theoretical understanding of what is it that this could be, which in a sense is the whole debate. Is this stuff going to be like more spreadsheets or more web or more internet? Is it just going to be another building block for another platform and then there'll be another platform after that? Or is this more like computing or electricity? And it's a fundamental change in the nature of what we can do. And we don't know.
Do you have an idea?
I don't like trying to analyze stuff on the basis of zero knowledge. And this is why I think the intellectual kind of fallacy of the whole Doomer thesis is you're basically trying to reason out the nature of something that you don't know anything about. And, your argument can be logically flawless, but that doesn't mean it's correct. So, it seems to me a sort of a very pointless intellectual exercise. It's like trying to reason out the nature of God. I mean, you can come out with, something that's mathematically correct and says, therefore, God must be like this. But the problem is it's built on an absence of knowledge. You don't know. And this is the Descartes fallacy.
How do we know when that big discontinuity moment happens? So the equivalent of the iPhone moment. I guess some people knew when the iPhone came out, this was, the moment. Most people didn't. How do we know that it's not, as you said, ChatGPT that comes out, and as you said, like maybe this is it. Maybe this is the big moment. There's nothing more to come. As an observer and an analyst, what's your process to try to make those calls of this is the big moment, or actually we're nowhere near the big moment?
I think if you knew what was going to happen all the time, then we'd live like in a different universe. There wouldn't be any VCs. Like everything would be risk free. That's like, please invest only in the companies that work. I think, and if you go back a couple of years, like everyone kind of knew that mobile had happened 5 years ago at least. And so then there was a long time where the question was, well, what's the next thing? And the two big candidates, people spend a lot of time talking about crypto and Web3. And like, is this the next platform that you would use to build software? Not Web3 in like a generic sense of blockchains, but in the sense that like you could actually build distributed software on a blockchain. You could build Instagram on a blockchain, and that would work differently in important ways. So that theory is still sort of around. There's a joke that like people who are still working on crypto are like those Japanese soldiers who are like lost on an island in the Pacific and didn't know the war was over, which is sort of funny, but not quite true. And there's a bunch of people working on crypto. It may be that crypto ends up just being like financial infrastructure. It may be that crypto turns into like another platform. The other big candidate, of course, is some combination of VR and AR. It's always been kind of tough to see VR as being mainstream, or certainly as being any bigger than games consoles. A couple of 100 million people, maybe. Easier to see glasses, something like this, maybe, as being the next universal device after smartphones. Problem is we don't have the optics to do that. We don't know when we will. Like Apple and Google and Meta show stuff. Apple's got stuff. It's not clear that we're close to having something that would look like this.
The survey you mentioned, where I think it was what percentage? 20% found continual usage in AI and the other 80%.
That's not my survey. There's a whole bunch of people have done so. There's like half a dozen surveys.
And was that predominantly in consumer, or was it more sort of consumer usage or enterprise usage?
So consumer, where there are surveys that single out used at home, used for work, the used at home numbers tend to be lower. The used for work numbers tend to be slightly higher. And then they vary. So, people with STEM degrees use it 20%. 20% of people with STEM degrees versus like 5% of people with no degree. But even then, you've got a STEM master's degree and you work for a tech company, 20% of you are using this every day. Now, on the one hand, it's a very glass half full, glass half empty kind of observation. Like on the one hand, you said, oh my God, this is amazing. It's only been out 2.5 years. Already 20% of people are using this. And that's way more than smartphones or PCs or the internet. Much faster. That's a really dumb analysis, because to get a smartphone, you had to pay $1,000. To get a PC, you had to pay $2,000 or $3,000 and wait for your telco to deploy broadband before it was useful. So of course it took longer. The original, I was just looking at this the other day. If you wanted to run VisiCalc, which is the first successful software spreadsheet, which we can probably talk about in the late 70s, to get the Apple II with enough memory and a monitor and a disk drive and a printer was something between $10,000 and $15,000 adjusted for inflation. So yeah, ChatGPT happened faster than that. So why is it that 50%, 60, 70% of people have looked at this and said, don't know what to do with this?
I'd be very curious if I'm sure there's a magical number within OpenAI where you sort of use ChatGPT a number of times and then you become a super user. So I suspect in time that will emerge, because I definitely had a tipping point where I wasn't using it that often, and then it became my default for everything.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty here. So some of this is this just because it's early and it will grow? Some of it is this about breaking patterns and forming new habits? Like you had to realize that you could use Google for that. Some of it is about what kind of job do you have and what kind of work do you do? Some of it is you need, and then there's a thesis that says, no, this is like, go back to the early 80s. The idea was you would buy a PC and then you would buy a database program and you would make your own inventory management software, or you would make your own tax calculating software. And the answer is no. You buy an inventory management software, you buy QuickBooks or whatever it was at the time. And you can, this is always the thing, you can believe two things at once. You can believe this is a future and also believe that it has to get wrapped in software.
Mm-hmm.
And so the devil's advocate position here would be to say, these people who are using it every day now are the same people who use Notion and Slack. They're the early adopters who are always looking for a cool new tool, and this is a cool new tool, and they found it, and they forced ways to find how to use it. And that overlaps with people who work in a certain kind of way. Like, if you think about which teams can adopt Notion and which ones can't, well, small, tech-forward, flexible companies where people are doing lots of different things and people are free to do their own processes, then people are likely to use Notion or Airtable or one of these no-code things. If you're doing accounts payable inside Exxon, No, you don't get to get rid of Oracle and use Notion. That's not how it works. And so there are these sort of, it's kind of like the point about, meetings. Like most people have like 2 meetings a week. So you get these startups saying, we're going to pitch something as AI thing that's going to make it easier to manage your meetings. Like basically the only people who have that problem are VCs. No one else has that problem. VCs and consultants have that problem. Nobody else has a problem. I've got 45 meetings this week. So that's the kind of, there's a sort of devil's advocate here, which is that it's clearly got product market fit in software development and marketing. It's got software development, so it's got product market fit for a certain kind of knowledge worker. Is it just going to grow out from those? Does it need something else to grow out from those? Or are those just the right people, the only people who can use it a lot as it is now? Does it need to get wrapped in product? Now, I think it needs to get wrapped in product, but I don't know. We'll find out.
I do too. And I think that's an interesting segue into sort of describing the value chain for our listeners. So in terms of how, if you look at the AI landscape today and what's been built and what could be built, how would you break it down?
So it seems to me that we're sort of 2.5 years into the model wars. Anybody with $500 million can have a frontier model. This is what DeepSeek demonstrated. It wasn't $5 million. It was like $500 million, maybe double that. But lots of people have got $500 million. And model building today, it's sort of like the feeds and speeds era of the PC industry, like in the late 80s, early 90s. Like all these computer magazines, like group test, 20 new graphics cards. Which one should you buy? And they're like, well, how many megahertz? How much RAM? What video bandwidth? Do you want CGA or VGA? Well, it depends. Do you want 16-bit color? Do you want 32-bit color? Well, this is 32-bit color. Okay, you're supposed to know what that means and care what that means. A lot of it is like that. What context window do you want? Like, I don't fucking know. I don't know what that means. And so some of it is like that. But in generality, like you've got these sort of 3 things here. On the one hand, you've got these half a dozen, and how you count it, half a dozen to a dozen organizations trying to build a frontier model. And they're kind of leapfrogging each other. And every week there's more models and more acronyms. And instead of like USB and PCI, it's like MCP and RAG and whatever the new acronym is. You can't, no one can keep track of all of these. And there's hundreds of papers a week. No one can keep track. It's like Moore's law. If there were 10 Intels. The other side of it is there's hundreds and hundreds of SaaS companies who are picking this up and using it to solve some point solution inside some industry. So a friend of mine is using LLMs, and the problem he's solving is you do machine translation of mainframe COBOL code into Java, but the machine translation produces terrible code that's impossible to read. And so he's using an LLM to clean up the code. Is that an AI company? Or is that like a digital transformation company? Or is that, mainframe process optimization company? I don't even know what the category is called, but it's not like an AI company. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people picking those up and using that to solve some problem. And this might be a $50 million opportunity. That might be a $500 million opportunity. That's what SaaS was. Except with SaaS, we're basically using databases and cloud. And now we're basically using LLMs. And then we're going to go out and solve some problem for the billing departments in airlines, or whatever it is. So you've got those kind of 2 fields where there's lots of stuff like specific creative engineering energy going on. And then in the middle, there's this kind of big fuzzy mass of like, you're supposed to use AI. But what does that mean? And it reminds me just a little bit and rather painfully of metaverse. Where people will say, what's your metaverse strategy? And you would think, and my reaction to that was, well, I can talk about VR. I can talk about NFTs. I have an opinion. Say what you like about NFTs. At least there was like an actual specific tangible technology there and an idea. I mean, most of it was nonsense, but it was there was something you could put your hands around and analyze and have an opinion about. Should games be interoperable? Should social media be interoperable? Like maybe I can have an opinion about that. At least I know what we're talking about, but I don't know what you're talking about when you say metaverse. And there's a sort of a similar point now when like Toby, what's his name at Shopify says, everyone in the company, you need to be using AI every day. Okay, what do you mean? So I'm running the accounts payable team. So, we've just migrated from Oracle to Salesforce. You want me to use AI? What do you mean? Toby, what am I supposed to do? What do you want me to do? And so there's a lot of this kind of fuzzy area in the middle where people are kind of pushing for product market fit. And I think the interesting thing, which is I'm sort of trying to write something about, is that if you look at as a consumer, as a normal person, you look at OpenAI, ChatGPT, or Google, or Gemini, or Meta, or Anthropic, or DeepSeek, or Mistral, or Quem, or whatever the others are, how do you tell the difference? I mean, there's a different, the logo is a different color. And you have this pull down list that says, do you want to use GPT 4.0, or for a different result, do you want to use GPT 04? And, you know, there's a moment here where we've had this huge amount of technology push, but it's not clear what the product differences would be in the products, or what a product strategy would look like, other than like put a better UI and better branding on the model. There's a strategy of building better models. There is like a corporate strategy where Meta says, you know, we want to make this commodity open source infrastructure that's sold at marginal cost, and Google says this, you know, and Amazon kind of says the same thing, and Google and Microsoft have kind of got a different approach because they've got a cloud business, but they've also got a legacy software business that they don't want to have disrupted by this. And so you can kind of, and you can talk about what Apple's trying to do and so on. So there's like corporate strategy, but it's very hard to say, well, what is Mike Krieger going to do that's going to be absolutely fundamentally different from what Kevin Wheel's doing? And in a sense, the only product strategy you can see at OpenAI is like hire Kevin Wheel.
Is what, sorry?
And Kevin Wheel, hire Kevin Wheel.
Okay.
and Kevin, I mean, I saw this sort of interview with him and Mike on stage, and Kevin is like, okay, I wake up in the morning on Tuesday, I get an email that says we've got a new voice model. It's like, okay, I guess I'm adding a microphone button to the app.
Fascinating.
This is not product strategy.
And when you look at all of that, do you think that we could be in a similar situation to when we had the big search engine wars, and, you know, then almost all of them went to zero, right? So could OpenAI, for example, be the next Ask Jeeves? Or do you think that they've now got to the scale of brand? That seems to be their main moat. And, you know, I guess no network effects, but you would argue with Google's offerings, maybe their moat is somehow with data. And maybe with Meta and Grok or X, it's some kind of network effect. Do you feel like those are roughly the parameters? And yeah, do you think some of these companies or some of the LLMs companies could go to zero?
I think as a sort of primary level, there aren't any network effects. This thing does not get better if more people use it. And that's partly because you're not retraining it continuously. It's partly because the data that's getting that would come from the queries is so tiny as a percentage of training data. So, you know, what happened with, you know, and the comparison with Google is interesting, because what actually happened was there were lots of people doing search one way, and they were all basically commodities, and they thought the answer was build a content portal. You know, Yahoo builds a media business around it. And they thought search was a commodity, we'll outsource it to Google. And Google had this fundamentally different approach to search that swept away all of the pre-existing search engines because it was so much better. And it then had a network effect, which was, as we all kind of understand, you know, Google knows what you search for next. When you get search results, you pick one, and Google gets to see which search result was right. And so Google gets better because more people use it. It's not yet apparent that there's any equivalent network effect in LLMs. It's not yet apparent that there's any equivalent winner-takes-all effect. There are things people can are trying to do to build stickiness. So the memory features that they're all starting to add, where they can kind of go back and remember the stuff that you've asked in the past. But that's not really a network effect, that's stickiness. And I mean, it might evolve into a network effect. You can sort of see that it might start to learn there are other people that are kind of like you. But, you know, a lot of stuff would have to happen first for that to really work. Meanwhile, there's sort of brand and habit. And, you know, there's this very live conversation about, you know, why do people use Google as they go through the antitrust remedy stage of the competition case that's going on in the US right now. Like every day, these are the hearings that are happening. And so clearly some of Google's advantage is habit, that it became a verb and people go to Google because they go to Google, but they also go to Google because the results are better. And if you go to Bing, like the first result seems fine, you use it for a day, you're like, no, this isn't as good as Google, and you go back. And, you know, Microsoft acknowledged this, and this is why they talk about the network effect. Of course, when Microsoft say this, it's kind of self-serving. Now, part of Google's story here is they will say, no, it's about accumulated expertise. It's about accumulated institutional knowledge, that we understand that it's no longer just PageRank and which results you click. There's hundreds of other things going on, and we know all this other stuff. about how to build good search and what all the problems are and what breaks and the 20 different, 50, 100 different ways that things that you have to know about in order to build a good search engine. And so it might be that you get kind of, that OpenAI kind of pulls ahead because they have that accumulated knowledge. But that would be something that would have to happen next. It's not something that's happening now. It's not apparent that that's how it will work. And in parallel to that, of course, there's the question we were just talking about, which is it actually going to the UI, the chatbot, and typing something in the right UI? Or is the end state of this that it gets abstracted away for most things? And the answer is probably both. That, there'll be thousands of fast apps where this is an API call. But there will also be things where you go to the LLM for specific things. But there is this real challenge of how would you know what you would ask?
It seems, perhaps it's a bit flippant to say, but it seems somewhat obvious to me that the value will accrue the application layer, because even in the case of OpenAI, most of the excitement has been driven by ChatGPT, and that's been the enabler.
Yeah, most of the money comes from the API.
Fair. But to your point about it getting commoditized over time.
But this is what we said at the beginning. This is the sort of elemental question: is do these things keep getting better? Because if these things get like 100x better, whatever that means, then you really can just go to the model and say, "Hey, I need to buy a house,"
right?
And it will go and log into your bank. I mean, I'm going through this at the moment, but it will go and log into your bank. It will put together the pack for the mortgage broker, and it will put together this, and it will put together that, and it will just, it will give you 5 choices and say, which one would you like to buy? And I'll say this one. And then you go and have a viewing, and then the next day it says, right, this is your new mortgage payment. It's been set up. Don't worry about it. It's taken care of. It's done. Poof. And that's not really science fiction at the moment. You can kind of squint and imagine that's possible, but it certainly doesn't work now. And you could build something you could certainly build something today that would try and do that. The problem is, it would have a 5% error rate at each stage, and there's 45 steps. And what does 45 times a 5% error rate mean?
Yeah, it seems like
it means it hasn't worked.
Manta's getting quite close to that, no? I mean, maybe not the mortgage element of it, but
yeah, I don't know. It's like, there's a story about somebody who was going to Cannes Lion, and their corporate travel agency booked them a hotel and a train and a flight to go to Caen.
Amazing.
Find themselves in Normandy.
Okay. One of the evolutions that we've looked at in venture is, venture capitalists were very excited about the LLMs, and you'd see these huge $100 million seed rounds, and even now we're seeing with people who've left OpenAI ridiculous seed round valuations, because that's where some people think the value will accrue. And then suddenly DeepSeek came, and everyone panicked that it was all commoditized. And having been very dismissive of what people called, chat GPT wrappers, suddenly people thought, actually, it's these individual new startups who are, because of the value of the UI being more valuable potentially than this commoditizable LLM, that's where we should invest. It feels like that's just going to kind of continue to go back and forth over the next few years while we figure out what's happening. But if you were still a venture investor, where would you be putting your money?
Well, it's funny, if you use Snapchat, we don't say, it's just a GCP wrapper. So there's always a question of, how much are you really just reselling an underlying commodity with a very limited amount of differentiation on top, and the platform will clearly do that. And how much is the platform just providing basic primitives, and you're building the product go-to-market, the understanding of the problem, the customer support. You're building the whole company on top. And, there's, God knows, we don't look at the entire SaaS industry and say, well, they're just AWS wrappers. On the other hand, clearly there were a bunch of people that really were just thin GPT wrappers. So the thin bit is much more important than the wrapper bit, because everything's a wrapper of something. Apple is a TSMC wrapper. This is, certainly you can reduce this to absurdity. So the important word there is thin. Are you doing something that is naturally and inevitably going to end up as part of the platform? I mean, it's interesting to compare ChatGPT to spell checking. And you go back to the 80s, right? You go to a computer magazine and they would have a group test of 10 spell checkers, and they're each like $200. And they've got the whole product matrix of this spell checker is $150, and it's got a library of 25,000 words, and it supports Word and WordStar and WordPerfect. So you should buy this one. And then, of course, that gets integrated into Word, and then it gets integrated, and then it just becomes a wavy red line, and then it just gets integrated in the operating system. And like the idea that that was like a $200 product now seems ridiculous. But there was a time when like that was it. Like you wanted to do charts in a spreadsheet, you had to buy a chart program. So there's always this question of how far up the stack does the platform go? And again, this comes back to the question of how good does the model get? Because if the model gets 1,000 times better, then of course it'll go all the way up the stack. You can just go to it and say, buy me a house, and it can do it. Then we don't know that. And as long as that's not what's going to happen, then you're betting that Amazon and Google and Microsoft and OpenAI and everything else are going to go out and one by one build the thing that automates tracking the maintenance schedules for aircraft engines at airline companies. And of course, they're not going to do that. They will sell that software to people who go and build that and sell that to airlines. They'll sell it to Accenture, or they'll sell it to the startup that does that, just as they always have done.
I want to ask you more about defensibility. So we've seen a couple of companies who use one of the models, the LLMs, and then help people do things like edit code or make websites. So companies like Lovable, Cursor, just extraordinary revenue growth that we've never really seen before. We certainly didn't see that in the Web 2.0 era or the mobile era. So it's all very impressive. People get very excited. Over the weekend, someone leaked the prompts that were used on things like Lovable and Cursor. And, you could argue that one leak just sort of gives away basically all of the value of some of those companies. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But if you take that as a sort of starting point and assume it's true for a moment, how does that make you feel about some of the very, very rapidly growing companies that have started to emerge from these very early parts of the new AI era?
Yeah. So again, to me, that's like saying, here is a SQL that Salesforce uses to generate your lead gen page. So Salesforce is out of business. Well, that's not what Salesforce is. That's not what Cursor is. Cursor isn't like a carefully crafted prompt. Cursor is a product. And the same thing for all of these. How do you build product? How do you build go-to-market? How do you build defensibility? How deeply do you understand what the market needs? And if the answer is like not much, and it's basically just email, then sure, that will get, that's not defensible. If the answer is you've got to have a huge sales force and you've got to have really, really deep understanding of how the market works, then yes, that will definitely get absorbed.
And in terms of building product in the AI era, products like Cursor, do you think it's just the age-old wisdom, deeply understand your customer, build a product for them, have a smart distribution model, or are there some qualities to these AI products that are different from the previous era in terms of how you build them?
Well, in a sense, it's always different. But each of these new things has some set of characteristics that make it different. Clearly, one of the sort of foundational questions or sort of challenges in building anything with an LLM is that it's a probabilistic system. Not a deterministic system, and it's useful because it's doing things that you can't do with deterministic systems. But that also means that it's not going to produce exactly the same result in exactly the same way every single time. And so what most people building quote unquote GPT wrappers are doing, part of what they're doing is the tooling, part of what they're doing is the go-to-market, part of what they're doing is how do you think about that? How do you manage that? How do you filter and process and pre-process and post-process the input and the output so that the user knows what this is, or that you manage the problem and so you can kind of control what will and won't happen?
That feels quite distinctive from what's come before.
It is. And, there's a lot of, there's this old sort of joke that, the English joke about the Frenchman who says that's all very well in practice, but does it work in theory? And you can kind of spend too much time sort of philosophizing about what this stuff is. But, there's a kind of important kind of conceptual shift in that, traditional software is deterministic. It does exactly what you ask it to do every single time. What machine learning and both machine learning and now this are probabilistic systems, and they solve things that we weren't, not for practical reasons, maybe theoretical reasons, but certainly practical reasons, things that you couldn't get deterministic software to do. But that also comes with their own sets of challenges, and it may be that as the models get better, this is kind of the part of the models get better thesis. If the models may get better, they're right all the time, even if they're still probabilistic. They're right 99.99999% of the time. So who cares if they're not actually deterministic? But another way you can kind of think about this is that what deterministic software does is it does things that are easy to explain to a computer, but maybe hard for people to do, like calculate 1 million mortgages in your head. It's very easy to tell a computer how you would do that. It's very hard to do it. What machine learning did was it was things that are hard to explain to a computer. Like, how would you know that credit card transaction is weird? Like, is that thing behind you really a Christmas tree? Like, what is it? Then maybe a way you could think about LLMs is that they are good at things that would be easy to explain to an intern. As soon as you get to something that would be hard to explain to an intern, then you're in trouble, because you realize I'm going to ask it how to do this thing, and I gave it 3 lines of instructions, and of course what I got back wasn't what I expected. But then you think, well, if I'd given that to a 16-year-old, they probably wouldn't have given me what I wanted either, because they wouldn't have any of the kind of context or experience or understanding of what it was that I wanted. And for actually getting an intern to give that to me, I'd need to spend like a week, showing them stuff and training them and building things. And then then I could give them the 1-line prompt and they do it. And so LLMs now, and it's kind of a useful way of thinking about it, is they do what would be easy to explain to a person, or easy to explain to a person who has no context, or very little context.
Benedict, we ask everybody who comes on Giant Ideas, what is it about themselves that has allowed them to be so successful? And in your case, I'd love to ask you not just that question, so what it is about you do you think that has allowed you to become such a successful analyst of technology and trends and see the future and assess the past so well? But also with AI, what are you doing in your work and your everyday life to make the most of these tools?
Well, obviously it's because I'm both very clever and very modest. I mean, I'm not sure how else I can answer that question. I think a slightly more sort of neutral way of answering the question is like, I think, an old boss of mine said that my career kind of looked like Brownian motion, and I sort of ended up in the right place eventually. But I think everyone has a sort of a Venn diagram of stuff that you're good at and stuff that you enjoy and stuff that people will pay for. And then you kind of pick what your priorities are. And there are some people who work in finance doing something that they hate, that they're very good at, that gets paid a lot of money. And there are also people who do something that they love and they're very good at and pays almost nothing. And so you kind of, choose hopefully at least 2 of those, and preferably all 3, but, it depends. But then different people have very different kinds of skills. There are people who are very good at, you can make a list of 10 or 15 skills, and no person probably has more than 2 or 3 of those. And so I sort of, slowly iterated into something that aligns with certainly 2 of those and preferably 3.
How old were you when you figured that out?
I'll let you know.
And what about your use of AI tools? How are you using AI to stay on top of it?
Well, this goes back to AI. Like, I take a photograph, it's perfectly exposed. Is that AI or is that software? Well, 10 years ago that was AI, now it's software. What LLMs am I using? I struggle to find use cases.
Interesting.
So I don't write code. I don't brainstorm. I don't need a draft of an email. I do proofreading, which is basically with better spell check.
Do you use it for any softer elements, like, asking it for advice? That's a growing usage I'm seeing among quite a few people.
I don't know, and that may just be being on the spectrum, but I struggle enough asking for advice for people. The idea of asking for advice for computers, to me, I mean, I've played with ChatGPT's voice mode, and to me, this is right at the bottom of the uncanny valley. It's like you start asking a question and it says, "Hey, that sounds really exciting. Tell me more." Think, fuck off. It's literally the uncanny valley that people talk about in computer animation. I find it very, I have the same kind of visceral reaction that people talk about there. The other people who think this is great, I'll just kind of bounce ideas back and forth and get something back. I suppose part of the challenge here is always like, what these things do is they tell you what most people would probably say. Do you have lots of use cases where you just need what most people would probably say quickly? And there are some people who do. Like, if you work in marketing, give me 50 ideas for a marketing slogan for this brand. Like, again, it's like having an intern. Like, it gives you 50 ideas, 25 of them are crap, but 5 of them are things you wouldn't have thought of. And it's still better than you spending an hour with a blank piece of paper trying to work it out. I don't have that use case. Other people do. So I kind of struggle to find ways in which this is useful. But, I have a very, very specific and very narrow set of things that I do. And for those things, this isn't particularly helpful. As I said, I don't write code. I'm the lawyer looking at the spreadsheet and thinking, well, that's great, but I don't do that. What do I do with this?
Well, thank you, Benedict. That was a hugely informative discussion. And we so appreciate you joining us on Giant Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Benedict.